All right, in this lesson, we're going to talk about a few different methods for retrieving objects. The first method is the all method that we briefly talked about in the previous lesson. This method returns a query set, and when this query set gets evaluated, we get all the objects in a given table, like the product table. Now, sometimes we want to get a single object, like the product with the ID 1. To do that, we use the get method, and here we pass a lookup parameter like ID equals 1. Then we could also use pk. That's a special argument. So when we use pk, Django will automatically translate this to the name of the primary key field. So our primary key field might be ID, it might be code, whatever. We don't have to remember. This is the benefit of using the pk argument, okay? Now, unlike the all method, the get method returns an actual object, not a query set. The reason for this is because once we get an object, it doesn't really make sense to do anything extra with it. We're not going to sort the result. We're not going to apply additional filters and so on. So here we get a product, and that means we should rename this variable to product. So always pay great attention to the name of your variables and functions. I cannot emphasize this enough because this is one of the main issues I see in a lot of people's code. They have a function like get airplane. So you see that function and you think you're going to get an airplane. But when debugging the application, you realize that this function actually returns an orange, and that orange ends up getting stored in an object called book. Don't do this. So always pay great attention to the name of your variables, okay? So let's save this and see what we get. Back to the browser, refresh. Let's look at the SQL tab. So here's our select statement. So we're selecting all these columns from the product table, and here we have a where clause to select the product with the ID 1. Now Django also adds a limit clause, a limit of 21. I'm not entirely sure why they use 21 here. To me, it looks like a magic number, but this is something you can find in Django source code. So for now, don't worry about it. This limit doesn't really make a difference for us. Now, one thing you need to know about the get method is that if it cannot find this object, it will throw an exception. So if we set pk to 0, look, we get an exception of type does not exist. So to handle this, we have to wrap our code inside a try-catch block. So back to the code. First, we're going to import the type of the exception on the top. So from django.core.exceptions, we're going to import object does not exist. Now note that I've put all my Django import statements next to each other, so my code is cleaner and more organized. Compare this with this. So we are importing something from Django, then something from another app, then we're going back to Django. Again, this is a little bit ugly. So I prefer to put all Django import statements next to each other. Now we need to wrap this line inside a try-catch block. Don't tell me that you don't know what a try-catch block is, because I covered it in detail in my Python course. So here we type try, then we type except, followed by the type of exception, which is object does not exist. Also, note that you don't have to type the full name of the class. So here I'm typing objDNE, and with that we can easily look up this class. So we can use abbreviations, okay? Enter. Now in a real scenario, here we want to show an error to the user, but for now, don't worry about it. So I just want to pass, okay? Now back to the browser, refresh. This time we didn't get an exception, great. Now, this try-catch block looks a little bit ugly. We don't want to repeat this pattern over and over in our code. So let me show you a better way. First, I'm going to delete the try-catch block. Good. Now, instead of the get method, we can use the filter method. Now, this method returns a query set. So right away, we can call the first method of the query set. Now, if the query set is empty, the first method returns none. So in this case, product is going to be none. We're not going to get an exception. Check this out. So save and refresh. Great. Now, sometimes we want to check the existence of an object. So over here, right after the filter method, instead of the first method, we can call another method called exists. So first we apply a filter, and then we check to see if there is an object in our query set with this criteria. So in this case, we're not going to get a product object. We get a Boolean value. So we should rename this variable to something like exists, okay? So these are various ways to retrieve objects. Now in the next lesson, we're going to talk about filtering in detail.